everyone. Melinda, you are our first panelist, so I'm going to unmute you. And if you have something to share on your screen, um, I'll unshare. Let's see. I I
There we
stopped sharing mine, so I think you can do it now.
go. Alrighty, so let me share this. And we'll go there. All right. Well, I missed one very important thing about me. I am a Bruin as well. Got my undergrad at UCLA, so there's actually
Hey.
quite a few of us at HCD. There is quite a representation from UCLA, so I won't tell you where I got my master's degree, but you could probably guess. So I'm going to just briefly share with you some highlights of what housing element law is and to give you a foundation of what housing element law does, it is intent, and some of its history. Hopefully that can set up the conversation. Just as a bit of background, I've worked in housing element law almost my entire career, so about 20 years now, a little bit less than that. So I'm very familiar with housing element law. It's kind of been my bread and butter for a very long time. So what is housing element law? Housing element law is basically the primary market-based strategy that the state has to affect housing supply. And what I mean by that is that the statute recognizes that housing is a private-public partnership. Essentially, the public or the private part, the market, is what actually delivers the housing supply. There is a few housing units here or there that's built publicly through public funds, but the vast majority is through private development. So in order for us to influence that private development, we have to have a public strategy in which to determine where housing needs to go, what densities, what the rules are around how development gets built and housing gets built. And that happens at the local level. So basically the most fundamental decisions about where housing supply and affordability are made at the local level. So where the housing element comes in is that it's one of 7 required planning documents that a local government has to have in their general plan, which is basically their charter for their city. And what it does is, over a very small period of time, 8 years, it says how the city is going to accommodate its housing needs and where housing should be built and what are the rules around that. It's very unique in that it does allow the state, this is the only piece of that general plan where the state actually has a review authority over it. So we review and approve every housing element and ensure that it meets statutory requirements. So that actually gives us a lot of influence in the housing supply and affordability through our interactions with local governments to ensure that they are meeting those statutory requirements around housing element law. The other thing about it is that every city and county in the state must do this. They're required to by law, regardless of whether or not they have special rules because they're a charter city. Everybody has to do this. And so, that's all 539 jurisdictions. So we review every single one of those, every single adopted element and draft. So just to give you a little bit of a history, it is a 50-year-old law. It started in 1969. That's when housing elements were first introduced into general plan law. And in the early 80s, it really kind of shaped up to be what it is now, which is this whole idea of the regional housing needs allocation process. Essentially, the idea here, this was through a HUD, a Housing and Urban Development grant, Fair Housing Grant, The idea here is that every local government has to plan for its fair share of housing. Sometimes it's called fair share housing, um, as well as the RHNA, or the Regional Housing Needs Allocation process. And so over the years, and there's these cycles, right? Every planning period is about 10 years. It's 8 years for a locality, but then it's staggered throughout the state. So there's like that overlap here. We are currently in the 5th cycle of housing elements, moving into the 6th cycle, which is why this is important. There are some major reforms along the way because it is a very old law. And so you'll see that on this slide. The most major reforms that we've done recently were done in 2017 and 2018. And those reforms were really about increasing the transparency around how housing needs are given to each jurisdiction, and also some more certainty around those sites that jurisdictions must select in order to demonstrate that they can accommodate this new growth. So the key players and roles. So obviously the legislature, they're the ones who actually make the rules. They say what goes into a housing element. HCD, we have a variety of different requirements here. One is we are required to determine that new housing need for an entire region. We also provide a lot of technical assistance and advise in the preparation of local government's housing elements. We review the housing elements themselves, and then we do a lot of monitoring and enforcement. And that's a kind of a newer role that we have, but one that's becoming more effective, and it makes it even more important that housing elements have actions and programs that actually mean something. And we also insist in implementation of those actions and programs. The council governments is the regional government, and they distribute the RHNA to each local government. So they do the allocation of that regional housing needs allocation number. The local government, of course, they're the most important in this because they actually do the plan. They find sites to accommodate new development. They have programs and actions to actually implement that. And then they provide us interim reports. And finally, I want to talk about stakeholders. Stakeholders are so key here. We have a very limited staff up in HCD that reviews these. There are 539 jurisdictions. We heavily rely on our stakeholders to provide us information and ground truthing for each housing elements. We review third-party comments that we receive during our review. We also reach out and talk to stakeholders if we have questions or there's something in a housing element that may look a little different to us, or we require some further investigation. The housing element process starts, of course, with the regional housing needs allocation number. That is the number of new units needed over an 8-year period. The council of governments, like I said, distributes that. Then each local government plans for that regional housing needs number in the housing element. They also develop, and this is really important, an action plan to set the table for development. So the role of the housing element is basically in that private-public partnership to facilitate and set the table for development to occur. So that means not only is it finding sites that can accommodate the new need, but also making sure that the rules and the regulations in place that kind of govern how housing is done is clear of constraints and will allow for development to occur. So that's that kind of setting that table. The jurisdictions implement and submit their annual reports, and then we respond to complaints from stakeholders for lack of action, and we can also remove compliance of housing elements and refer any infractions to the Attorney General.
Quick, before you continue, Elizabeth wanted to know if you could go back to the timeline.
Yes. What's the question?
There was no question.
Oh.
I think she just wanted to, she wanted to take a picture.
Oh, cool. All right. Here we go.
Perfect. Thank you. You're good to go.
All right. So what is the regional housing needs? And the reason why I'm spending some time on this is that it's kind of the foundation of the housing element, because especially for new housing development. So what it is, it's a projection of additional housing needs needed to accommodate projected housing growth at all income levels from a start of the projection period to the end of the projection period, or that 8-year planning period that we talk about. We use the words projection and planning kind of interchangeably. But it's not a prediction of how many permits or construction. It's not a ceiling. So like say a jurisdiction says that they have a very small need and then they meet that need and then they can stop building. No, this is not a ceiling, it's a floor. And what's really important is that it's not limited to existing land use capacity or growth controls. So if a jurisdiction says, hey, we're built out, right? We don't have any more residential land. The RHNA doesn't take that into account. What it says is then you need to identify sites for redevelopment, you need to do rezonings, you need to find other opportunities for development to occur because the growth is here, the growth is coming, and you need to be able to accommodate that. Similarly, if there's a growth control ordinance that limits how many units you can put on a site, the RHNA says you have to at least be able to accommodate this housing need. So just to give you an idea of what's in a housing element, there are 3 main analytical portions of the housing element. So that's the data-driven side. The first is housing needs. So that's like, you know, how many are renters, how many are owners, what kind of special needs populations do you have, what is your homeless, do you have homeless population, what are their needs, farm workers, etc. Also, do you have any existing units that are currently affordable that could convert into market rate in the planning period? The second bubble is all about the available land. So that is, do you have enough land to accommodate new development that could accommodate your RHNA? And then the third bubble is what kind of development barriers are you seeing in the city or county? So that includes both governmental barriers, such as how long it takes for development to actually, go from, approve or from an application to approval, to non-governmental barriers like availability of financing. Of course, we have to look at what happened in the past to see whether or not that affects what happens in the future. And then finally, finally, all of that flows into this what we call development programs or quantified objectives. With quantified objectives. So that's our action plan. So that is what specific things is a local government going to do to help facilitate housing. And what's neat about this is that you have to have actionable plans with objectives, with specific dates in which you're going to try to achieve something. So it kind of puts a hook in there that we can then be able to hold local governments accountable. Of course, all of this is important. All of this is under the umbrella of public outreach. It's one of the most important parts of this. And you must outreach to a variety of different stakeholders, including lower income populations and or groups that represent their interest. So what the statute says is that local government must make a diligent effort to achieve public participation in all economic segments of the community. So what we look for there is, who did they consult with? What kind of written comments did they receive? How were those incorporated? This is where, if you're interested in being involved, is where you really come in. There's a couple different places. One is, of course, in the development of the draft at your local level. The other place you can come in is once we receive the housing element for review, you're always welcome to submit what we call third-party comments, which is basically a letter or an email or something like that to us that says what your concerns are in terms of a local government's housing element. Where your participation is critical, is developing information to include in the housing elements. Staff may or may not know the individual issues that you are looking at and have the data to back it up. So to the extent that you can provide them that data, it's more likely to get into the housing element. Provide guidance on developing programs. That's really important for making sure that the programs are going to actually be effective throughout the planning period. And then site verification, ground truthing. So like I said, we can't really go out and visit every single local government. So it's important that if you have an opportunity to go and visit those sites to make sure they are development opportunities. And if you tell us about that, we can take that into consideration. Education, and then of course on the back end, not just going away once the housing element's developed, but really sticking on the enforcement end, on making sure jurisdictions are actually implementing what they have. So that's what I got for the background.
Thank you, Melinda. So we're gonna do a quick poll right now, and just to remind everyone, this is being recorded, so we will post this online afterwards. So if you need to review anything, it will be online. So I'm gonna do a quick poll right now, just to get just to see where people are at on some of this. So okay, let me see how to do this. Okay. Well, I cannot seem to post this poll at the moment. Having some technical difficulties with this. But the poll is, where would you like to see more reforms? Where would you like to see more housing element reforms? 1, state legislation governing the process. 2, HCD standards in reviewing housing elements. 3, regional, as in regional governments like SCAG, Southern California Association of Governments. They work on the RENA number and the distribution. And answer number 4 is local government. So share your thoughts in the chat while I try to get this poll set up, if that's even possible. Okay, I will post them here.
Everywhere.
Yeah, I'm posting them in chat.
And if it's easier for folks, y'all can just post the number.
Yeah. Well, as people post their thoughts on this, let's move on to the second panelist. So that's Paavo.
Sure.
Thank you again, Melinda.
Yeah, thanks, Melinda. That's extremely useful. I'm lucky that I get to be the profferer of reforms rather than the explainer of the status quo. So thanks for explaining kind of how it works, Melinda. It's nice to virtually, where is everyone? Hi. It's nice to virtually connect with you in this time of COVID. And I'm excited to see 55 participants eager to learn about the housing element update process. Hopefully it's distracting from the crisis rather than adding additional stress. I'm going to talk about some reform ideas, but first I want to say that they all come from a collaboration really led by some people at UC Davis and UC Berkeley, Chris Elmendorf, Eric Bieber, and Moira O'Neill. And then I'll reference some other research also in collaboration with Michael Lenz and Michael Manville at UCLA. So really, they're all fantastic scholars. And I'm actually gonna post some readings. I would be a bad professor if I didn't give everyone homework.
Thank you.
Links to readings for everyone if this webinar doesn't provide enough information. So I'm going to talk about, I have actually a line here. I'm going to talk about kind of 3 areas that I think are important for reform. I'm going to talk about kind of a new approach to the sites inventory part of the housing element, kind of this idea of proactive local government programs to producing affordable housing, and then a new approach to the constraints section of the housing element. So those are kind of the 3 areas. You can see those, yeah, that I'd like to mention. Okay, back to my swank living room. Also another reading that I'm not going to post, but if people want to learn about housing elements, I highly recommend reading one if you haven't already. I think it's very, actually the best way to read more than one, because you'll see kind of the dramatic variation between how different cities do what in theory is kind of a similar activity in terms of assessing, especially in terms of assessing concerns. So with the sites inventory, I'll talk about first. Basically, the ultimate goal of our proposed reforms are to get housing built, right? I think the metaphor of setting the table as the goal of the housing element process is a useful one to think about, right? So local governments are in charge of setting this table in order to allow housing development to happen. But what we really want to do in the end of the day is feed the guests at our dinner party, right? We don't want to just have the table set and have no one eat. And so we want to make sure the table is set in an appetizing manner. And especially we want to be worried about how some cities are setting the table if no one ends up eating, when in fact their food should be so delicious that everyone should eat it, right? So maybe it's too long of a metaphor, but basically this idea where some cities where rents are very high, amenities are high, jobs access are high, yet housing is not being built. Kind of we want to focus on those cities and try to figure out what about their regulations is not allowing housing to be built, right? So kind of the way we approach the sites inventory part of the housing element is instead of thinking about asking cities to kind of find some vacant pieces of land where housing can be built, we want to get them to rezone land in the high opportunity, the high cost parts of the insensitive communities, parts of their jurisdiction, right? Because it's especially important to have more zone capacity, right? So we do have pretty strong evidence now about the importance of zone capacity, not just anywhere, but zone capacity in the high cost parts of the state. So this graph comes from this research paper we did and is available through the Turner Center website. The link is up there. But basically what it shows is y-axis, the zone capacity of cities, right? So at the top, these are the cities with a lot of zone capacity. These are the cities with not much zone capacity. The x-axis, I guess you can see it, it's rents. So these are kind of cities with low rents, and these are cities with high rents. And what we see is cities with low rents, it doesn't really matter how much zone capacity they have, they're not producing a lot of housing, right? So the colors show how much permitting is happening in these cities. So if you have a low rent city, the zone capacity doesn't matter so much. On the other hand, if you have a high rent city over here, and you increase the zone capacity, right, you get to this red zone where there's a lot of permitting. So with that in mind, we think about within a city, we want to have neighborhoods where rents are high, where opportunities are high. Those are the neighborhoods we want to have more zone capacity. So we have 2 ways that we propose going about this. One is more complicated, one is more simple. I think we should try to do both, depending on the legality of HCD asking cities to do, right? So the more complicated approach is creating this idea of a realistic probability of development, right? So currently, kind of the problem we identify with the RHNA process is that cities are obliged to set the table, they're not obliged to feed the guests. This idea says, how many table settings would you need if you wanted to feed all the guests we expect you to feed, right? So if a city really wants to build 1,000 housing units over the next 8 years, what would be the realistic amount of zone capacity that they would need in order to build those 1,000 housing units, right? It would not be 1,001 sites, or, you know, wouldn't be sites with capacity for 1,001, right? So the way we're proposing it kind of in the most simple way is to look at the last 8 years of development and say, look, in the last 8 years, you've built 25% of your zone capacity. Therefore, going forwards, if we want you to build 1,000 units, we're going to need you to zone for 4,000 units, right? So this is a complicated in a couple ways. I mean, one, politically, because it would be asking cities to rezone much more than what their RHNA targets are currently. So it would be changing kind of the way this has worked in the past. It's also complicated in a kind of more important way, or more kind of important way, I guess I'll say for now, because we don't want to ask cities without a lot of demand for housing to zone for a ridiculously large amount of housing. So it really gets into the problem with the way housing units have been allocated traditionally in many regions. So, you know, if Coachella, our favorite example, right, is built a very small percent of its zone capacity, it's getting a large RHNA number. We don't want to ask them to zone for 10 times their RHNA number, right? So we need to think about doing this in a smart way that doesn't unduly burden low demand cities. The simple way, the additional simple way that we're proposing to get kind of more housing built in high opportunity neighborhoods, high cost neighborhoods, is developing a metric for affirmatively furthering fair housing that's applied to the site's inventory. So AB 686 created the idea of employing affirmatively furthering fair housing in the housing element more strenuously. And what we're proposing is a simple idea where, let's say 50% of your low-income housing RHNA target should be located in the 25% highest income neighborhoods in your city, right? So some kind of baseline metric where we can expect low-income housing sited in high income, high opportunity neighborhoods, right? So the 50%, 25% is just a first pass, right? We could think about other ones. And that, I mean, I think that approach really has the combined advantage of actually getting more housing built, because like I said, having more zone capacity in the high cost parts of the state will lead to more housing production, right? So more of that zone capacity will be used. But also it'll have the important benefit of putting low-income housing in high-cost neighborhoods, right? So actually affirmatively furthering fair housing. So real quick, I'll mention the programs, ideas, and then I'll talk about the constraints to development. So with the programs ideas, you know, we wrote this issue brief that we linked to and published to the Lewis Center. The way we rethink the programs section is thinking about a proactive approach to affordable housing development. So pretend you really wanted to get affordable housing built within your jurisdiction. And I think there's kind of two big changes that cities should make. The first one is being proactive instead of reactive when it comes to the kinds of projects they'd like to see. So currently, the way development often works is cities sit around and wait for a developer to propose a project on a site. And then once there's a project to talk about, they want to make it a little smaller and ask for some more goodies and negotiate with that developer. What we're trying to get is for cities to say, this is what we'd like to be built in our city. If you propose something like this, you can build it, right? So it's kind of like, I mean, basically what the TOC does in some ways, right? It says, here's some 4 tiers of options, choose one and you can get a clear path to entitlement. So this kind of gets at removing discretion from the process, but it also makes cities tell the world on paper what they'd like to see built. And then when that kind of project is proposed, they can't say no. So I think that's kind of one shift, this kind of proactive shift. And the other one we propose is raising local funds. So cities rightfully complain about limited housing subsidies from the state. and kind of unrealistic low-income RHNA targets, right? I think that is a real problem. But at the same time, very few of them are actively trying to generate local revenues that aren't inclusionary for low-income housing. So we have some ideas for what cities could be doing. You know, a basic one that I've not seen happen, but could be happening, is using the newly created short-term rental taxes for directly into affordable housing fund. This was discussed in LA. I don't think it actually ended up happening. But, or, you know, proposing bonds for affordable housing at the city level, right? So be aggressive about raising money for affordable housing. Okay, so the third thing I wanted to talk about was the constraint section of the housing element. I think that HCD has a real challenge on its hands with the analysis of constraints section, because it is really hard to analyze constraints, right? So there's this whole academic literature that we summarize in that Turner Center working paper about kind of how academics have struggled with the challenge of measuring how constrained a jurisdiction is. I think the key difference in terms of how HCD has done it before and how the academic community looks at it is the idea of cumulative constraints. So the HCD, another thing you should all check out is the building blocks section of the HCD website about housing elements, which has a pretty good list of kind of what are the different possible regulations that could constrain development. So everything from development standards, you know, too many setbacks, a lot of parking, et cetera, fees, high fees, delayed permit times, right? So there's all these categories of regulations that we know constrain development potentially. The big thing is what academics are always trying to do is add them all together and have one measure for a city that measures how constrained it is. So this is something that we're in conversation with HCD about right now, right? Trying to develop a model that both tells us whether a city is underperforming in terms of housing production given its market conditions, right? Given rents and given job growth, and try to measure this cumulative constraint in some way. You know, so there's a couple challenges kind of within there, but maybe I'll not go into them now in the interest of time. We'll just conclude by saying, you know, the housing element process really has a lot of opportunities for activism. I think local governments can be influenced in terms of how rezoning occurs. You know, with this, especially in Southern California, but probably throughout the state, a lot of cities are going to get RHNA targets that even without the probability of development component are going to require them to do significant rezonings. And I think the emphasis should be on doing those rezonings in neighborhoods where they'll have the biggest impact in terms of actual housing production, right? I think that the reliance on vacant sites that may be badly located or not going to sell because the owner doesn't want to or is waiting, right, is the wrong way to think about preparing the table, right? We want to set a table that's extremely appetizing for housing production. So get active in your city. I mean, I have a couple ideas we can talk to about in the Q&A if you'd like about kind of bringing more at the city level, right? So we've mentioned the city of LA as an important place since it's 30%, something like a third of Southern California's RHNA allocation, but every city really needs attention in terms of kind of past site locations and kind of past production and past constraints that may have not been undertaken. So those are my notes. Thanks for your time, and I will pass the mic to Dario.
Thanks, Paavo. Someone had a quick question here. If you could repeat what you were saying about rent credits and if there was something you said about tenants too.
Sorry, can you say again?
Was there something that you were saying about rent credits? No. Okay.
I didn't have any slides. I had an outline. That's my outline. But most of this, I mean, this outline is really based on the Lewis Center issue brief called something like A New Approach to the Housing Element Update. So if you want to read a 5-page version of this outline, I would suggest looking there.
Okay. Well, some of these questions that are being sent in are really good, by the way. So thank you to the audience for sending in such thoughtful questions. Some of these we'll do longer follow-ups and send out to everyone afterwards. So before before we get to Dario, let's just do another poll. Can you all see these poll results from the first poll we did, where we'd like to see more reforms? There was a tie between state legislation and local governments, which I think makes sense because state legislation is kind of the biggest way to make change. It affects the most things, and then local governments, that's where we all personally see the most issues around planning for housing and doing housing elements. So let's see if I can do the second poll. Your daughter, Paavo. Okay. So, number 3, poll 3. What is the most important factor for concentrating housing?
What does concentrating housing mean?
Where we should focus our planning for housing the most, like where we should focus on having the most housing density. What's the most important factor for that? Not to say there aren't many factors, but just, this is a subjective question, just to see where everybody's at, what they think the most important one is. But Paavo, obviously, love to hear your answer to this. Can you see the poll? All right, so let's end the polling. Submit your final answers, everyone. Let's end the polling. Okay, so the top result was housing costs. And then the second most popular answer was job access. Paavo, tell us the right answer for this question.
There's no right answer. I mean, all of them combined in a thoughtful way.
That makes sense. All right, so
It
Dario.
depends.
Okay, Dario, do you want to take it over now?
Sure. So thanks again for the opportunity to speak to everyone here. I wanted to talk about 3 main things and then engage in discussion or answer any questions as well. I will take the opportunity to just speak to the first poll, which was, that tie between the local.
I can't see you, Dario.
Oh, well, let me click a button.
I mean, I can't.
Let me click a button. The host needs to click me on for a video. All right. So it's interesting that there's a tie between action taken by local government and state government, because while it'd be nice to see action by the local government, it's more likely to see action, or what we've been seeing is action by the state government coming in order to arrive at these zoning increases or allowable density increases that are necessary to get the building industry going to the rates that it needs to be in order to arrive at the RHNA numbers that we're adopting for the city of Los Angeles and the rest of the Los Angeles region. So I answered local government because it would be great to see more action at the local government level, but it's more likely, and we're seeing more action at the state level. The 3 items that I wanted to talk about are how some of the neighborhoods in the city of Los Angeles, for example, have been able to get out of providing their fair share of the housing that's necessary under RHNA. What density, translate density a little bit to a something more tactile that we can see some examples of, so that the abstraction is removed. And then some of the trends that we've been noticing in the housing market locally recently or historically, which point us to some potential ways to respond. So I'm going to try to share my screen here if I've got a button for that. Let's see here. Host, can you share with me how to share my screen here?
Do you see there's a share? There should be a share button at the bottom. Do you not have that?
Let's see, a mute, stop video. Participants, polls, share.
There's shared.
All right,
That was
okay.
it.
There we go. I'll just share my screen and then I'll flip through these. So the first on downzoning. A lot of the research that we've done really builds on Dr. Greg Moreau's dissertation from 2013 from UCLA. So once again, props to the Bruins for the strong work coming out of there. This is an example. This is one page of the appendix from his dissertation, and what he looked at, among other things, was how community plans in the city of Los Angeles over their years, this is 3 plans adopted in Venice, have reduced their population capacity by changing the classifications of zoning, changing the allowable density of zoning. So places like Venice over the years have reduced their population capacity to half, and same goes for the rest of the city overall has been reduced by 60% over the last 50 years. So we've continued work along those lines, and this is the rank of the communities in the city of Los Angeles and their downzoning over time. So this is the rank of how some communities have reduced their allowable density in order to either not provide the housing or, you know, a number of issues, which is maybe something we can get into a little bit further later. This is a graphic that we developed with tax assessor data. So this shows the remaining housing stock, for example, in the community of Venice, from the decade of the 1900s gathered. And the color code represents the building type, so the number of dwelling units by building. And representative of the city as a whole, there's this decline that really takes a sharp drop after the 70s and then continues, which is consistent with Morrow's dissertation and the downzoning efforts across town. Some of the communities that have really been seeing massive displacement are seeing that there's just not construction going on. You know, it really has dropped to a low in the 80s and 90s and has not picked up. And you can see that the dip is below the numbers of what's remaining from the decade of the Great Depression. So this is a map of the same color codes for the Venice community. And this is sort of my segue into the conversation of density and how lack of definition of these terms or lack of consistent definition of these terms obfuscates the issue and really doesn't help. So there's, for example, recently, Dr. Monkkonen, we were discussing the 10, 20, 30 dwelling units per acre, and I'll show you how that's relatively low compared to the bungalow courts that we used to have being built in the 20s in Los Angeles, or even the medium scale apartment buildings. This is Venice color coded by the building type. So you can see that there's very much single family dwellings in the gray, and then, you know, a number of the 2 to 4s spread around, some of these 15 or 15 and very few 15 to 24 unit buildings. Okay, that's kind of how the housing stock shapes up. Now, this is where I translate building type into density, and what I want to try to show by comparison is that the density of Los Angeles is relatively low. It's quite low, actually, and taking a part of Los Angeles like Venice, which is an older neighborhood. And so we would expect more densely built construction there. This is the distribution of the different building types. Okay, so notice that Venice has the 10 to 15 unit building type represents about 56 units per acre. 5 to 9 represents 46 units per acre. So I want to show everybody what, for example, take across Los Angeles and other parts in the 1920s. This is a 48 dwelling unit per acre type of construction. So what you have is 9 units. You have 3, 3, and 2 in the back. And because of its compact nature, but still, allowing a lot of open space, this allows for 48 dwelling units per acre. Then fast forward to the 70s. This is the type of building that you were having built in the 70s. This is 56 dwelling units per acre. It's 14 units. And nowadays, both of these are really out of the equation. I'll go back to what's being built.
Quick question. David asked on the chart, what were the communities that ranked highest in decreasing housing capacity? And the top 5 would be nice to know.
Sure, they're ranked right here. So the top 5, are listed here, 1 through 5. Brentwood, Encino, Grenada, Sherman, and San Pedro. Thank you. And for more information, just check out Moro's dissertation. Find it online, or we can disseminate it. But that really gives the entire picture of sort of the why and how and other variables, their statistical relationship. So this is an example of a building that's 24 units. This is in San Diego, and this is 24 units on a 9,000 square foot lot. This is about 9 units on a 9,000 square foot site. It's 3 lots. So this is about the same lot size. This here is about the same lot size as this building. This is 9 units. This is 24 units. If a full acre were to develop at this density, which is a four-story wood frame construction, this would represent 150 dwelling units per acre. So that is far in excess of what's needed in order to reach the RHNA numbers. So we've done analysis of what would be needed in all of Los Angeles. Let's continue with the Venice example, since it kind of brings it to a case study that we can relate to in size. The average density of Venice needs to arrive at 38 dwelling units per acre in order to have the dwelling units that would be its fair share, that would represent the fair share of the 2029 RHNA target. So how do we arrive at 38 dwelling units per acre on average in Venice? There's several ways to do it, but this once again represents 48. So if a community like Venice averaged this, and you have, let's say there's a normal distribution, and there's some houses that are less dense and some houses that are more dense, or some projects that are less dense and some projects that are more dense, but the average is the average of the bungalow court, that's more than sufficient. If the average was this 1970s dingbat, apartment style, that's more than sufficient. And what we're seeing is that the zoning codes, including building setbacks, parking requirements, and the allowable dwelling units per acre, or the density of the zoning classification, don't allow for really any of these to occur in so many places, but especially the insensitive areas, as it were. And so as a result, there's a really big deficit. So a lot of construction needs to occur, which maybe brings it back full circle to the discussion that Paavo Monkkonen described regarding the relationship between the rates of production that need to occur in order to arrive at the 2029 RENA target, and what the zoning, what the allowable zoning needs to be in order to arrive at something that averages less than this. Leonora and Rod, I can continue down this line, but maybe you'll help contain this conversation a little bit with a question for direction or something, because otherwise
This
I
is
can get
great.
into the route of some opportunities that we've identified for advocacy, or otherwise discuss more construction and design related topics.
No, I think this is great. There were a couple of questions that were sent in just back on the Venice plans that you shared. There were 3 Venice plans. If you could go back to those and let us know the dates for those.
Sure, yeah. Check out Greg Morrow's dissertation, 2013, The Homeowner Revolution. The community plans of all of the 35 community plan areas that have a residential zone in them are described there, but the dates for Venice specifically are 70, 87, and 2000.
Great, thank you. You were sharing some numbers about the decline of housing production. Did that include TOC and other density bonuses?
So this graph here, if you're still seeing my screen, this graph here is not yet seeing the effect of the TOC of measure triple J of the TOC policy. Density bonuses, yes, because there have been others prior to that. And here's one really interesting thing to just note about TOC. We've evaluated what the expected impact of TOC would be, and others have as well. There's some scholarly journals published on the issue, and we've developed some research further. What is notable about Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles, is that because TOC covers a large area where the zoned capacity has decreased over the last 50 years, the bonus in many locations allows for less dwelling units than those that currently exist in the built environment. So while the TOC type of policies will contribute to more dwelling units from type of buildings, the rate of building that we need to arrive to in order to reach the RENA targets is simply not going to be met by the TOC sites, the TOC policy. As a matter of fact, the density of those locations would need to be increased substantially in order to arrive at the numbers. So in other words, there's this gap between what we have on the books right now in terms of policies. Let's take TOC style density bonuses, which are good and are necessary, but insufficient in that everything else termed the missing middle in some literature, which is this whole chunk right here that used to be built quite a lot in the post-World War II era, but then dropped off as a result of these down zoning efforts. We see the missing middle being pinched out, and really the only thing being built are these very large projects, which are fine, but as I mentioned, insufficient. So the policies that will allow these types of medium rise, high density buildings to be built will bridge the gap between what is currently being done and the RENA targets that need to be met by 2029.
Thanks so much. So let's do our last poll, and then we'll go into Q&A for the panelists. So the last poll, I'm very interested to hear everybody's opinion on this, and feel free to share your own answer in the discussion if you don't like any of these answers. But What would be the most effective strategy for making housing more affordable? 1, upzoning. 2, eliminating parking requirements. 3, inclusionary zoning and or density bonuses. And 4, funding for social housing.
And before we go into the Q&A, can I just do a brief like sum up for all the people?
Yeah, thank you. That'd be great.
You're welcome.
Want to do the summary while we're waiting for people to submit their answers, Rod?
Sure, yeah. So as I stated, I just moved to California. And so I wanted to sum up because I think it's been very good for me as a new, resident of both California and the city of LA, to learn about this, but also just to bring everything back around. So, the way, and if any of the speakers, if I'm not correctly summing up, please feel free to chime in. So the way I heard everything tonight is Melinda, you talked about the current process with the housing element. You gave us a timeline and you told us how things currently operate. And then Paavo, you came in after that and you gave us some understanding of what housing elements could be, both at the local, and you talked about the state level as well in terms of making change. But I wasn't sure if your focus was only on the local level or not for what change could look like.
Yeah, I mean, it's focused on the local level, but probably cities won't do it by themselves.
Yes. Okay.
Hopefully the state will make them.
And then Dario, you talked about somewhat looking forward, but also just understanding that as society or as the LA region currently exists, this is what the zone capacity is and what it would need to accommodate housing. And also what I appreciate is that you showed people that density isn't what the stigma is. If we could get housing for more people and also still have not what people usually assume is high rises, but there can be a certain amount of density per acre that still housed a lot of people, but didn't, let's say, impede upon sunlight or some of the other concerns expressed by the public. I don't know if that's a good summary of tonight, but.
On the low courts.
That was great, Rod.
I concur.
Okay, so we're going to end the polling now. So here are the results. Upzoning was number 1. Upzoning, the idea of allowing more density, which makes housing construction of multifamily apartment buildings more possible, makes it cheaper, it allows us to have more homes. So I think I tend to agree with that. Do any of the panelists want to share their opinions on the most effective strategy for making housing more affordable?
I mean, I think like I was talking about before with the cumulative constraints, right? So you can upzone as much as you want and have extremely high fees and parking requirements and all the other stuff and block development, right? So you can effectively block development with any number of regulations. And that's why you need a comprehensive look at it rather than just one thing at a time.
That makes sense.
And I concur. There's no silver bullet in this. I think that upzoning is important, especially in making sure that there's capacity for new housing development, but we have to be able to get the housing through the entire pipeline from you know, the process and what kinds of housing are built, like Paavo was talking about, all the way to actually pulling their building permits and building, not to mention financing and everything else. I mean, it is so complicated that it requires a multi-pronged approach.
I third that there's no one thing, because it would, as Paavo mentioned, if upzoning is adopted, there can still be limits on the number of dwelling units by parking requirements, setbacks, other fees, other methods. So it's a combination of upzoning and parking and removing parking requirements that will really result in, is what we've seen, will really result in an increase in the rate of production to arrive to the targets that are necessary. One thing that I'll mention is really difficult is just how obfuscating all of these metrics are. So for example, when we're talking about 10, 20, and 30 dwelling units per acre, and there's a fight between the haves and the wants to bring 30 down to 10, we're really working within a very, already within too small of a range. Once again, the bungalow court is 48. So if the fights going on currently in the policy world are whether something should be 10 or it should be 30, that's still so far below what is necessary that there's really this gap of a common language to discuss these things. There's net density, there's gross density, and so all of these things can really serve to I believe just create a lot of apathy and disengagement with issues, and then really leaving the policies left to the those with the greatest influence to really arrive at what is in their interest. So upzoning is definitely a really big deal, and all of the things that have historically been used to still make areas more exclusionary need to be addressed as well. And it would be great to see, I wonder, Melinda, if you know of any additional teeth that the housing element law is getting now to really enforce the arrival of the housing targets, whereas in the past the requirement has been for municipalities to zone for these capacities. The law hasn't required these municipalities to actually reach the housing number. So
I mean, it's still a planning document. I mean, number one, there's a couple things to say about this. One is, again, going back to who actually builds housing. You know, there's the market to take into account. That being said, where jurisdictions have the greatest influence is approving housing and making sure that they are removing those constraints and doing everything that they're supposed to be doing. So to the extent that we now have enforcement abilities on the back end, especially when developments are going through the process, that has been super helpful this past year or two that we have this new authority. For example, you might have seen in the newspapers with Simi Valley, we intervened in that situation and reminded the city of their obligations under state law. And as a result, the planning commission said, well, we actually have to approve this project. Now we'll see what the city council does. They continued they continued it into the next into April, but we'll see. So we have a lot of influence on that, you know, to get to basically everywhere where the cities have control. We want to make sure that they're easing the way for development. There are some requirements around additional development incentives if targets aren't being met. Basically saying, well, we're going to remove further constraints in order to let the market do what it is going to be. But as of right now, it's still a planning requirement. It is not a building requirement. In fact, there's stuff in the actual statute that says cities are not required to put financing or funding towards actually building these.
Thanks, Melinda. I have a question for you, Melinda, submitted by someone from the audience. Is there legal authority for HCD to set RHNA numbers that would lead to zero rent-burdened households?
So rent burden is one of the metrics that we use at the regional level to establish the regional need. And the metric we use currently is in comparison, and this is what's in the statute, is a comparison against what the national average is. This is actually what is one of the factors that led to the Southern California region getting 1.3 million in terms of its regional number. So that was a really critical factor in that. So, I mean, we are bound by the statute in that, but that's having that new factor that hasn't been in place before has been a really critical part about starting to kind of dig down and address some of the existing housing needs that we are having.
Great. Paavo, do you want to add
I had a
anything
question.
there?
Yeah, I mean, if panelist prerogative question asking. I'm curious, Melinda, if you can speak to this question of thinking about different sites in the sites inventory in a different way, sort of what, as Dario was mentioning about kind of the large project sites versus the missing middle sites.
Oh yeah. No, that is something. So I mean, when I showed you my graph of when the big major changes have happened, one of the big major changes that really kind of started to address that was back in 2003 and 4, but it hasn't been addressed since. And that is starting to get to this idea of density as a proxy for affordability. So the way that the statute has, the way that the statute kind of is laid out for sites is that each jurisdiction is required to zone for their different varying income groups. So low, very low, moderate, and above moderate. And the lower, in order to get to like what is zoning for lower, right? That's a question. What does that even mean? And so there, you're starting to kind of relate types of development to density. So the idea is that you can achieve economies of scale necessary to build affordable housing on more dense housing. So they have some requirements in the statute around that. In terms of the missing middle housing and like above moderate and missing middle, there's no requirements currently in the statute around that. There are some pieces of legislation that are being proposed this year to start trying to get at that. Like, what does it mean to have zoning or sites that can meet your moderate or above moderate needs? But as of right now, in the statute, it's been kind of stagnant in that area since about 2004.
And then maybe just to follow up on that, and not to put you on the spot, feel free to say, we don't know yet. I'm curious to know how you're thinking about ADUs in terms of.
Yeah. ADUs are great. ADUs have such an amazing potential for development. And in fact, we're seeing that throughout the state. We're seeing actually a 5-fold increase in ADU production. ADUs are a critical part of your site's inventory. And so what's allowed is that is some sort of estimate of projected production of ADUs in your site's inventory, and then that can be used to meet some of your housing need. So that's kind of how it's playing out right now. I think one of the things that we're thinking about on the state level is what the potential effects of all the new legislation is going to be on that capacity for this next 8 years.
And then, so remind me how cities are going to be able to count the estimates of ADU production in terms of which income category they would
Yeah.
be able to use, and like
So that,
be able to justify that.
mhm. So that is based on an analysis that they do of what's going on in the market. So, for example, looking at existing market rents in the area for ADUs that are for rent, doing some analysis around, price per square foot, doing surveys. A lot of cities are now doing surveys on what those ADUs are going to be used for, whether or not they're actually going to be rental stock or not. All of that goes into a estimation of what percentage of, what affordability level. Typically what we see is about 30 to 40% of the estimated capacity is for lower, because just because it's smaller, it's going to cost less. But then others are for moderate and above moderate. I mean, what we don't see is that 100% of their ADU capacity is going to be for their very low. That's just not realistic, because we know. I mean, my friend in Mountain View right now is building an ADU, and he's going to be renting it for about $2,500 to $3,000 a month.
Not low income housing.
Nope.
And what will there be like some expectation in terms of the data they present on? As someone that worries about rent data a lot, I'm wondering, are you going to have some minimum threshold of data quality that you're going to apply, or how will cities be asked?
So it's a little bit on a case-by-case basis. There are some jurisdictions that, for example, the Sacramento Association of Governments is actually doing this on a regional level for their jurisdiction.
That's what I was thinking. It would be much easier for the regional government to do it.
Oh, absolutely. It is actually one of the areas that we're really encouraging regional governments to kind of step in on. I think that cities would appreciate that.
So another question that we have from the audience is, why were housing elements introduced in 1968, 1969? Was there a civil rights motivation behind it, or was it something else?
Oh boy. So my understanding is that some of it came out of, there's a lot of different, and a historian would be so much better to answer this question, but there was a lot of kind of unsettling that was coming out of the 60s in terms of what housing looked like. Redevelopment was a thing, and there was a lot of things happening on a local level where areas were being completely gentrified or torn down, and so it was kind of put in there as, part of this motivation. I don't know if there was a civil rights part of this or not, but Paavo, I don't know if you've done.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, it was the era, right, of the fair housing state laws. So yes, I think so. I mean, so I think I would recommend both. There's an article I can put some by Silverstein, and Chris Elmendorf has an article about this. I'll put links in the chats. If you want to read the comparison of California's housing element law to other states, like basically there's like the West Coast, Oregon, California model to state-led local planning for housing, juxtaposed with the East Coast, Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts, which are much more fair share housing focused on low-income housing specifically, whereas the West Coast has more like a low-income housing and growth generally. As supposedly, Pete Wilson introduced the housing element law as a bill. Surprise.
Sounds suspicious.
I had one more question, Leonora, but
Go, Paavo.
maybe we should give deference to the audience for a minute.
Anthony, our
The sign says it predates Pete Wilson. Wow.
Yeah, Pete Wilson's more recent.
But he was a legislator back in the.
Yeah, he may have been mucking things up back then. I have a question as well, but I will also hold it for more audience questions. It's more probing to Melinda.
While I'm here, huh?
Panelists ask Melinda things.
Anthony requested to ask a question, so He's our policy and research director. So I'm gonna give him a chance to get in there, and then maybe we'll do another audience question, and then we'll go back to the panelists. If that's okay.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Leonora. First of all, hi, everybody. I'm Anthony. I'm our new Director of Policy and Research, and I'm so thrilled that we had such a strong panel for this webinar, and I'm glad you all wanted a distraction from coronavirus, so this is great. My question has to do with how small cities handle the housing element process. So I know bigger cities like LA, San Francisco, they have a whole planning department of hundreds of people, but what do the resources look like if you're a small city of like 30,000, especially if you're a historically low resources city? Can they work with HCD? Do they hire consultants, universities? How does it work?
They hire consultants and they work with us. We have a lot of technical assistance that we have available on our website. We're also, this time around, because of new legislation that allowed for more technical assistance money in this arena, we actually currently have a request for proposal out for some technical assistance that will be able to provide cities like site-specific technical assistance, one-on-one technical assistance. We're trying to really kind of reach out to make this less painful for local governments because it is a daunting task and there's a lot of laws and it's complicated. But primarily they rely very, very heavily on consultants.
Okay, cool. Thanks for explaining.
All right, I got a question.
Yeah, all right.
Dario, you were starting to say something about ways in which people can engage, as part of this process. Are there things that you would recommend that they do or push for at a local level, as people are developing their housing elements?
Okay, let me answer with all of the parts. Would you repeat the question so I can answer it specifically and then also go on my rants, given the opportunity?
So what would you suggest folks do to engage at a local level in their housing elements? Are there specific things that they should push for? What are some things that they should be concentrating on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've got the cynical answer and then the sort of sunshine, babies and balloons answer. The cynical answer is it's too late. You can't do anything because you're not in the decision-making authority. If between now and the next housing element update for your municipality in the next 8 years or so, you've arrived at a decision-making position, whether it's in Department of City Planning or elected position, City Council, for example, then I would say that's, in my opinion, really important. I think there need to be more people who are looking at the adverse impacts of not having made these changes yet, and also folks who are looking at what these changes look like in policy in order for them to be adopted. More people doing this work in the decision-making positions, because I think what is very frustrating I found working with communities here locally is that folks do want to be involved, and they do get involved in an advocacy role, whether it's communications with their elected representatives or the decision makers in government positions like city planning. There's just, it's difficult to steer the Titanic. It's the momentum of a bureaucracy is.
You're depressing me, Dario.
I started with a cynical one, so I'm gonna end with the babies and balloons. It's too late.
Change is possible, man.
Change is possible. Change is possible. I want to say that it's very important, I believe, to be in these positions of decision-making authority. Change is possible now, and also if you want to get involved, apply to your Department of City Planning. If you feel like there's more research to be done to understand something better, either go back to graduate school and get some couple of years under your belt, and then come out and run for office. Get involved by being the leaders. That's my sort of bottom line to the cynical one. The other one is there are folks of us volunteer for Abundant Housing Los Angeles, because there are folks of us who are already engaged in the process in this round and have a fair amount of work developed in order to engage with communities and take feedback from communities, so that communities have plans to advocate for, rather than sort of asking government agencies that are overwhelmed and swamped with a sort of lopsided funding to workload, that they really can't do much in terms of research and development, and really are just responding to the forces being applied onto them. So volunteer for Abundant Housing LA, start working with folks, and run for office.
But and maybe you should tell them what plan they should be pushing for. The logic behind the FAIR plan. Is that
yeah, I'll get into.
I've heard about this thing called the FAIR plan. What's that all about?
But there's the FAIR plan. The other thing I'll mention in butterflies and balloons world is build. Get involved as a community builder, whether it's building community in a social sense, but also in a construction sense. There are many roles to be entered into in the housing market industry to be the providers of housing. So the more of us that are out there putting more houses on the market, the sooner we'll arrive at the targets. Policies are certainly hindrances currently, but they can also be opportunities. There's a plan that we've developed. It's called the FAIR plan. It's empirically developed, and it takes a index of 5 categories of variables, which includes historic downzoning, but also includes environmental quality, school scores, opportunity in terms of jobs, median household income, transit quality, and makes a composite score for the different areas of we developed it for the city of Los Angeles, but have begun applying it to city of Santa Monica. It's a way to allocate where housing ought to go given the current conditions and things that are sort of lopsided that need to be balanced, like jobs, housing near jobs, and reducing daily miles traveled. I can share the screen again.
While you're, okay, never mind.
Sorry. Okay, so this is the results of the RENA target for the city of Los Angeles. The city of Los Angeles is going to be required to provide or plan for 464,000 dwelling units in addition. That is about 58,000 dwelling units a year in the city of Los Angeles. It's far more than, it's about 7 times more than what are currently being built in the city of Los Angeles. I can get more into the methods of the FAIR plan, but Rod, were you going to point the conversation in that direction?
No, I just wanted, because you were talking about this, just to make my own little plug, since you were telling people to get involved. For people who don't know, my name is Rod, and I'm the director of organizing. So if you'd like to get involved, please let me know. I can drop my email in the chat, and then after this webinar is over, and I will try and send out an email tomorrow, which will have some of that information, including, Abundant Housing LA's policy agenda, which, as we said, there's no one solution. We have a policy agenda that kind of has solutions from a variety of angles. And then we also have a variety of opportunities that you can get involved with. If you play video games, it's kind of like a choose your path type of situation, because there's all of these different angles you've heard about tonight and different levels of government. And we'll have more of that information. So in the meantime, you can also check us out online at our website. But I just wanted to make that plug since we were talking about getting involved.
Thank you, Rod, for plugging us. Also, I just want to point out, if you're interested in learning more about the FAIR plan and getting involved with the FAIR plan for the city of LA, definitely take Rod's advice and join us. And make sure you sign up for updates, and we'll let you know about all the opportunities to support that plan. And also, I just want to point out, Elizabeth from People for Housing Orange County is also participating in this webinar right now. And so if you're in Orange County, get involved with them, People for Housing Orange County. And so this next question that I think is really great is,
Can I just, sorry to interrupt, can I just say one quick thing? I'm not going to ask you a question. I just want to mention, kind of build on what Dario was talking about, the FAIR plan. I think there's an opportunity for every city to be presented with this challenge where they've all, you know, the regional government has decided to allocate housing through objective standards to the different cities within their region, right? So also we should be asking cities to allocate their RHNA number to different neighborhoods within their city based on some objective standards, rather than finding a bunch of vacant sites near the freeway that haven't been built on and never will be built on and saying like, look, we got some vacant sites, right? I mean, I think that's the shift. And so I think LA, you know, I think there's maybe a better chance for that. We'll see. There's people working on LA, but there's 86 other cities in the county, right? And 79 of them matter. So, you know, I think that for every city, that approach would be really useful.
Great. Yeah, I'm personally very excited about the FAIR plan and its potential to make a lot of really good housing change here in the city of LA. So this good question, I'm dying to ask you, Paavo. It's a question for you. So just to go back to like the points that you were going through in your presentation, how would you propose that housing elements avoid the situation where they are just doing a tower of affordable housing surrounded by just expensive single family homes? Like, how do we make sure housing elements aren't doing that?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, that's something that I mean, that maybe I get to pass the buck a little to Melinda, whether there's a plan for that. I mean, that was sort of what I was asking about earlier in terms of giving more credit to more plausible sites. I think with the, you know, you can look at a housing element like, I think Redondo Beach, where the last cycle, half of the units or more than half of the units were met with one old mall. And they said, if the old mall, we're going to count this old mall for 1,200 housing units. And then we don't have, you know, that's, and 500 of them are going to be low income. And then that's how they get it to their RHNA. And then that mall got downsized. I don't know, it's a whole big thing. But basically the idea is like, we don't want that to happen. And I think that's why, at least with this kind of realistic capacity approach or some probability of development approach, you can say, sure, you have a huge parcel that potentially could house 6,000 units, but you know, it's probably not going to get developed. You know, the probability of it being actually developed is very low for these reasons. And so if you instead, we would want to be incentivizing cities to say, yeah, we're creating 100 parcels where missing middle housing could be built that on average will provide more units. But I think, is there some check, Melinda, on abusing by having one big parcel with all the units?
I mean, there's several checks on that. In the housing element itself, there's definitely the analysis that really has to show what, especially if it's a non-vacant site, what the potential for development is. Redondo Beach is a hard case because of what their development opportunities are. You know, that really was one of their biggest development opportunities. But in this last time around, you know, again, that goes back to that whole density proxy to affordability, right? You could just count, say, hey, you know, it's high density, so it should be able to count for my lower. There is now checks in place where if it gets downzoned, or B, gets developed at a different income level than what they assumed in their housing element, they are required to find other sites. So it doesn't just stop at housing. The housing element sites inventory and being able to identify sites to accommodate your need doesn't just stop at the housing element. They have to have that throughout the entire planning period. So what I'm talking about is something called no net loss. Essentially, you can't down zone, or if you approve a development at a different income level or density than what you assumed, you have to make that up. So that's another big tool that we have to ensure that what's being proposed in these plans are actually coming to fruition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that from a process perspective, though, it's. I mean, the no net loss provision is great, but then by having very few sites with large potential, you know, you're not triggering that no net loss until somebody develops them, right? And so you're delaying this, where in contrast to having a lot of smaller sites, I think that
the problem with the smaller sites, again, so one of the issues with Redondo is the problem with the smaller sites. So there's a lot of sites out there that are postage stamped that might be really great for missing middle housing, but are not good for lower income housing.
Right.
And so we use that size as a proxy also for being able to accommodate lower income. So Redondo Beach, in this case, they did put a lot of their higher or their lower income, you know, probability on that particular site. Mostly because that's the only thing that was large enough to actually hold a new development.
Yeah. Has anyone ever looked through the sites inventories to see like what percent? I mean, it might be a good check. What percent of your total units are being met with, you know, no more than 20% of the total can be met with one site or something like that, or like have some cap on how much one site, what percent of the total one site can satisfy.
Nobody's done any work on that.
Maybe the new research and data director of Abundant Housing.
Anthony.
And then Melinda, Elizabeth wanted to know why that was not good for the lower incomes. You were talking about using it as a proxy.
Oh, small sites?
Yes.
Because you need, in order to be able to build affordable housing, usually you have to get some sort of subsidy. And those subsidies, those funding sources, there's not a lot of funding sources available for small projects, like 20 units or less. Most of them are at least 50 units or more. And so the idea here is that if you have a bunch of really tiny small sites, it is less likely that you're going to be able to develop that site into a project for that's affordable to lower income. So, so the statute actually calls that out specifically and says you can't use any site that's smaller than 0.5 acres or larger than 10 acres. It's the same problem on the other end, right? You don't want like 500 unit projects. Without some sort of analysis talking about why that actually is feasible, because it could be feasible in a local government. But you have to explain why that is feasible and, you know, what kind of programs you have for maybe some lot consolidation efforts. Or in the case of large sites, and this goes back to that discussion there, what kind of parcel splitting efforts do you have?
Thanks, Melinda. Dario, I know you wanted to ask a question, so.
Yeah, it's actually along the lines of what was just asked, so it's really good. It's also, I'm curious whether you know, Melinda, of anything along naturally occurring affordable housing, or what are the policy discussions around naturally occurring affordable housing? Because, well, a couple of things, you know, do you know of anyone who's looked at the relative cost of vouchers versus development of affordable housing? So in other words, if it's less costly to the state to provide rent subsidies or house,
Mhm.
vouchers to live in the either the existing built environment or a built environment that can be accommodated by vouchers, rather than the costs necessary to arrive at new 50+ unit blocks of let's call them projects. Whether there's any kind of discussion or push and pull there. And I'll just bring to bear, there's some academic literature evaluating the best practices in affordable housing. And there's these kind of two ends of the spectrum. There's the housing project and there's the scattered site approach. And there seems to be a consensus in the academic literature that the scattered site approach is better for multiple reasons. But the kind of quintessential example is that tower in London that went up in flames. That's kind of what, the nightmare example of what tends to happen to housing projects. So the scattered approach is less stigmatizing to folks who live in with some subsidy. Services are provided to areas that are integrated more than relegated or marginalized. So I'm curious to know whether there's anything about naturally occurring affordable housing and just the relative cost of the different types of affordable housing.
Okay,
I know, right?
Ginormous question. Okay, and this is my perspective, not the state's perspective. Yes. So there is pros and cons in everything, in every way you go. You get economies of scale by being able to build, 100% affordable housing. Also, cost of services are very, very high if you're doing supportive services. That being said, there is a lot of models and a lot of development that's happening where a portion, where it's like an 80-20 type of deal or some sort of like mixed income, that tends to be very popular. Our affordable housing, I don't know what naturally occurring affordable housing is, quite frankly, in California. I mean, I just gave you the example of one of the quintessential examples of a naturally occurring affordable housing is an ADU that my friend is building in their backyard for $3,000 a month, which is not affordable.
And can I just add to, because I want to listen to the rest of your answer, but there's a reason why it's $3,000 a month, because there's not enough competition to make a tiny little unit what its actual price ought to be. It's $3,000 because there's nothing.
We need to build more, quite frankly. We need to build more in order to be able to meet that supply challenge. And we need to build more across all of the income spectrum. So, I mean, I think that's really the answer, is we just got to find ways in which to build more housing, more dense housing, high rise. I would say that the stuff that there's building right now that's 100% affordable is absolutely stunning. It's beautiful. It's probably the best architecturally I really see. So, I mean, we're not building those high towers like in London, in California. That's not what's being built. So, I mean, like I said, there's a lot of different perspectives and pros and cons in everything. And California is a very special case that doesn't necessarily reflect the academic literature that's happening in the rest of the country.
Great. Thank you, Melinda. Rod, you want to say something? You're on mute.
I was like trying to do the Alt-A, but then I wasn't clicked into Zoom. Yeah, I was going to ask, there was a question that was asked by a participant, Taylor, that I thought would be a good question to ask to the audience. Or sorry, not to the audience, to the panelists. And so, we're talking about this issue, we need to build more. And so the question posed by Taylor was that one major issue is that large buildings with 100+ units, so wood frame, 7 stories, offer a poor quality of life, but are almost exclusively what is being built. And so why do the zoning codes seem to promote construction of these buildings, and what can we do to encourage the moderate level of density found in bungalow courts?
Paavo, you want to start us off?
Sorry,
Our
you
100
said that
unit
big buildings have a low quality of life?
Yeah. Do you agree with that?
I mean, it's funny that someone would say that, considering I thought all high rises were luxury condos. I mean, I think that like the idea that a certain building type has a good or bad quality of life associated with it is just like not the case, because you can find, I lived in Hong Kong for 3 years. It's great.
I
I
have
mean,
too. I
it's
love it.
like,
And
I
I
think that
guess,
there are high quality of life big buildings, high quality of life small buildings, right? I mean, I think that it's called in the academic, if I want to get fancy, it's called environmental determinism, and it's not a thing,
and I was gonna,
but it's a belief.
Taylor,
and I was
just
gonna ask.
interested
Oh,
if you could tell us a little bit more, like
Yeah,
what
but
your
I mean, I think that
concerns are.
having,
I'm just interested to hear more, like what your concerns are about quality of life in buildings like that. Maybe you can share more in the discussion while people
but I
continue.
mean, I think I mean, if the question was about low income housing specifically, I think having as a goal subsidized housing of all types is also important. I mean, I think that having large buildings that are subsidized is great, and having subsidized small houses and ADUs and everything is great too. So like, I don't, yeah, I mean, you know, I think the Palmer sucks, right? I don't know.
so
Yeah, those are bad buildings. But just because they're big, they're not bad because they're big. They're just bad because they're bad.
Management has a lot to do with it. Quality construction has a lot to do with it. You know, one of the reasons why housing, subsidized housing is so expensive is the fact that they do have to have incredible construction that will last over 55 years, which is a life project. You know, that will basically lower the cost of operation over time. So the construction of it tends to be a higher quality than just a straight market rate, because they can't cut those corners if they want to make sure that their operational costs last for as long as they need to. But I mean, to answer your question, I mean, I think that's something that people are grappling with right now. I mean, the nature of how things were zoned over time, the suburban model that has been in California over time has really, you know, really disincentivized these bungalow courtyard apartments. If you look at where they are in lower, like in single family neighborhoods. There are in, you know, older single family neighborhoods, things that have been, you know, around since the 1920s, 1930s, you know, but that model seems to be an anathema to folks who, you know, after World War II just wanted to build the big sprawling suburban areas. So in order for us to start getting that, to see some more of that bungalow courtyard style, we do have to start really encouraging our local governments to rezone those areas to allow for that type of housing development. The problem is that there's people who are existing living there who might not like that or not understand what that means. So it's a real big educational lift and a political will lift for local governments.
I'll chime in here as well. Just on the quality of life of towers and architecturally the history of architecture, as I see.
quick question before you get into this, because we've started talking about this, and y'all are researchers. So when we're saying quality of life, what does that mean to you? Because it could be that, right, like quality of life for one person is different, and I know there's academic research about this. So could we also just, before we get too deeply, kind of just lay some foundational setting for everyone to be on the same page? I didn't know if you, or if one of you, yeah.
I'll just keep talking. Okay, so when I'm thinking quality of life, I'm thinking health indicators. So whether you're thinking Millennium Goal health indicators, mortality rates, child infant mortality rates, and things of that nature, that's what I'm thinking about in terms of quality of life. The levels of violence, violent crime rates. I'm thinking of exposure to environmental risks. I'm thinking about vehicle miles, travel time spent in traffic, the thing, you know, socioeconomic status, all those types of things are quality of life indicators. The idea of towers having a low quality of life is, in my view, in the United States, part of what became stigmatized as the housing project. So in a post-war environment, right after World War I, when modern construction methods were producing these towers in the East Coast, let's say, they were really a translation of the single family dwelling, and they were stacked. They were these flats, right? And around Central Park in New York, you have these amazing houses which are in towers. That's what the post-war kind of Beaux-Arts towers were. Then you have World War II, and you have Le Corbusier's City for 2 million, and the towers that result from there. In the United States, they become housing projects. So in other parts of the world, towers of this type are luxury towers. In the United States, they became 100% low-income towers and became the projects. You know, quintessential examples, Cabrini Green gets demolished, and others in the United States. They have a stigma to them, and that's a thing. The G.H. Palmer buildings are really interesting because they are truly environmental, like have a high environmental hazard. They're at the highest areas of environmental risk. They're at the freeways. I mean, they are the areas where you least want a highest concentration of people. I've also heard anecdotally that he designs his buildings in order to exclude the public from the interior experience. So there's this sort of exclusionary design, urban design language to them, which is not cool. That doesn't necessarily translate to bad quality of life to the folks living inside, but it does for the folks outside. So there's several reasons why the Palmer buildings are a bad example of what ought to be occurring. Someone, or in the messages, they said that you know, big buildings have bad landlords. So to me, other than the quality of life for the folks who are living in these towers, it also comes to the question of who builds these projects, and therefore who gets to benefit from the construction of these projects, and who owns the land or the parcels in these projects. So 50+ dwelling unit projects are not built by mom and pop builders. They're very large, and they're outside of the realm of possibilities for even local home builders who are doing the missing middle. Let alone just regular folks who want to increase their wealth by additional rental revenue and things like that. Who gets to benefit from the construction of those towers also is not necessarily locally geared. In other words, if these big projects are done by a firm that's out of town, their headquarters out of town, they're hiring consultants out of town, and the economic spillovers of the construction are just they're not kept within the locale. So it's a sort of exportation of resources in that sense. And then if they are in a condominium ownership form, then yeah, they tend to be luxury condominiums. So who gets to own the land and reap the benefits of the growth in the economy and the equity built on that is folks at the higher end, which don't necessarily need more of the growth of the economy. So the zoning that we have currently in the city of Los Angeles, which really focuses or puts its eggs in the basket of these types of towers being the way to get out, are not only not arriving at the rates of production we need, they're also benefiting a narrower and narrower sector of the population. Whereas, you know, the missing middle not being just for higher rents, but just being an avenue for greater rates of production, which would arrive at more dwelling units and lead the whole housing market to reach more of an equilibrium in prices. Not to mention they can be more easily owned by locals, and you know, there are financing streams for construction that are different for projects that are 4 and under, which are more accessible to the general population. 5 and above become commercial loans for construction. So it just kind of narrows the pool of who can participate more and more. And right now, when we're facing a situation where what is needed is more housing, more production. It's not simply with the towers that we're going to arrive there. It's sort of all hands on decks. It's all the towers with all the incentives they're getting, but all the regular people doing their part to also increase the housing stock. And in order for that to occur, in order for the regular, let's call it the just the free market, it's
There's no such thing as the free market.
it's not the term
Markets are created.
I'm looking for. The
Created
term,
by social institutions.
it's not the term that I'm looking for.
But can I just disagree with, can I just make a point that the vast majority, I was trying to look for the stats because my colleague Mike Manville has them somewhere in my phone. But the vast majority of rich people don't live in towers. And the vast majority of multifamily building residents are not rich. We do know about a few luxury condo towers, but like actually rich people live in single family houses, and actually people who live in multifamily are not rich. So don't perpetuate the stereotype of luxury tower as the worst thing in the world.
So I think, we only have like 5 minutes left, so I just want to make sure we get to one final question. But I just want to appreciate Taylor. Thank you for that really interesting question, and I think we've had a great discussion about it. So just the final question is for Melinda. What enforcement mechanisms other than lawsuits, and maybe you could talk about lawsuits a little bit too. No, actually, I'm sorry. Like, please, I'm sure only talk about what's appropriate from in your role. So what enforcement mechanisms exist to ensure that local governments comply with the intent and letter of recently passed housing legislation?
All right. So we have several different enforcement mechanisms that we are using. Almost a majority of it is actually in the technical assistance realm. So we have there is I'm going to type it down here, an email address that if you see something, you can always send something to. It's called compliance review at hcd.ca.gov. And so what we do there is we have kind of a multi-pronged approach. We look at a variety of different things. It could be something as it relates to somebody not implementing something in their housing element. It could be a development going through that may have some issues, and we can use mechanisms in the statute such as Fair Housing Law, Housing Accountability Act, Density Bonus Law, that we can kind of hook onto and be able to we want units in the ground, and to remind them of their obligations. After that, it's kind of like this progressive discipline model that we have, where we may go to pull their compliance. And if you don't have a housing element compliance, there's several things that could happen. One is, of course, lawsuits. And not just from the state, but also from local advocates. There's actually several advocacy groups that are definitely watchdogs in this area. And it could then result in fines or cities losing basically their building or their permitting ability. So there's that. And then also we can refer to the Attorney General's office and go that route as well. So there's several different mechanisms. I would actually have to say, surprisingly, something that's come up is that the majority of the issues that we've been seeing, at least in the ones that we're dealing with, because we're dealing with, right now we're in triage mode because we only have so much staff. So most of the complaints that we're receiving are coming from developers, and a lot of it has to do with both the planners and the city not talking the same language as the developers. And so they're cross-talking. And so we come in and we do a lot of like mediation in order to get sometimes they just don't understand each other. So that's something that we've been doing a lot. So we're looking for ways in which we can expand this role, looking at different kinds of resources. There's a resource out there that kind of shows you what's going on in every agenda of a city, to kind of expand this role of where the state can intervene on this backside after the planning to ensure that housing can get built.
Great, thank you so much. So I think this is all the time that we have. So it's 8:30. But thank you everyone on the panel. Thank you to our panelists.
36 participants remain.
So
Thanks, 36 participants. You
What
can
was it at the peak?
it was like about 57 at the peak
Nice.
that I saw, at least. I wasn't watching it the whole time. Yeah, but thank you. And thank you to the audience. Thank you to the 31 people who have remained. Actually, most of them stayed the whole thing. So, thank you for the great questions. So I'll also send out some of these remaining questions to the panelists for follow-up. And please do get involved with Abundant Housing LA and check out the Lewis Center. You know, just shoot
Stay
us an
tuned.
email or send us a message on social media if, you know, there's anything that you want to talk about or any other way you
You
want to
should
get
make like
involved.
a list of every city's meetings about their housing element. Does HCD do that?
No,
That's
we
a new
don't get
job for HCD.
notified until afterwards usually.
Oh, really? Oh, that's
Yeah.
true. There's no
Um,
centralized. Maybe the regional governments could do that in terms
Yeah.
of
Well,
like
that would be a great thing for them to do.
consolidating.
that would be
They seem to
that
have
would be
staff.
great. Rod just shared his email address in the chat, so reach out to him, especially if you want to get involved with volunteering. Rod, is there anything else you want to say before we?
No,
finish up?
thanks y'all, both to the panelists and the participants in the Lewis Center. This was great. First webinar. Stay tuned. And just to let y'all know, we'll be sending out the next Thursday will be a virtual happy hour. We don't know how that's going to go, but you know, we just want people to have a space to get a little bit of sociability and have a great quality of life while we are stuck in our buildings. So yeah, thanks everyone again. This was super great. Yep, that's all I have to say.
Did we link to the FAIR plan, Dario? Because that would be good. I mean,
We're going to send out an email tomorrow, and I have that to be included.
great.
Great.
Yeah, I'll mention that if any of the 56 folks are interested in how you can personally get involved in construction, in building homes in your community, you can reach out to me because it's going to take all of us.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Thanks
All right.
everyone.
Night.
Thanks for
Bye.
organizing.
Bye.